wanted to upload a video championing this particular album, which I almost feel has no right to be as good as it is. Okay, so after the 1970s, every Deep Purple album since that 1984 reunion attempted to capture the magic of the Mark II lineup. It might have even featured the Mark II lineup. Unfortunately, I'm not the biggest Perfect Strangers fan. It just sounds like generic kind of corporate or commercial metal of the time to me. House of Blue Light I actually like more, but don't love it by any means. Slaves and Masters doesn't really count in a way. Battle Rages on is okay. Meh. It's just disappointing. They were never able to capture the magic of Mark II. But maybe that's too much to ask for. Rock groups capture the brilliance of their early years. But they had the original lineup. It was just sad that they couldn't. And, you know, they're going to put out another album with Steve Morse instead of Ritchie Blackmore. Gee, what's that going to sound like? You know, Steve Morse is in a jazz fusion outfit called the Dixie Dregs, kind of purely instrumental act. Maybe this will be the kick up the butt Deep Purple needs in a way, because Ritchie's too focused on commercial-oriented music and making money at this point, apparently. Well, maybe not. Blackmore's Night is what it is. And, this is a Deep Purple album that sounds like the Mark II era. Sounds like in-rock, true to Machine Head / Made in Japan era. Deep Purple with a new kind of modern touch. You know, Steve Morse sounds distinct from Blackmore, and the group's clearly influenced by some of what's going on around them in the 1990s. I might even say this is a great little release. Oh my god. I'm not the only person who champions this album. I'm pretty sure it's this one that Martin Popoff champions very highly. It was on the list of his favourite albums. And, it's terrific. It's way better than it ought to have been. You want it to be good, although it just feels so organic and uncynical. Amazing. I didn't feel quite as enthusiastically about the follow-up album, Abandon. I liked Bananas in 2003, and Rapture the Deep I like less. Now What I really, really like. Infinite, kind of crap in my opinion, but Whoosh, we'll get to. Whoosh was pretty fucking amazing in my opinion, actually. But the band on here. Now, Ian Gillan. Let's cover this. Maybe it's the fact that Ritchie Blackmore is gone as to why this album was the finest Deep Purple album since Machine Head / Made in Japan. Well, actually, I really like Burn and Stormbringer as well, to be fair. They're very good, of course. Come Days of the Band I like a bit less. I don't think it's very good, to be honest. Obviously, a lot of people feel that way, as it were. But here's the thing. Ritchie Blackmore just didn't feel it anymore. He didn't want to make the kind of music anymore. In a way, he only wanted to do the heavy rock music in the early 70s because Zeppelin were huge. He wanted to ape off of that. Then he moved into Rainbow, and then he made Rainbow a commercial band once Foreigner got big. It is what it is, unfortunately. Now, Ian Gillan, upon Deep Purple reuniting in the 80s, Blackmore's ultimately the band leader. He's been around the longest, and it was his direction. Like, John Lord was the band leader at one point, but after the concerto for group and orchestra, Blackmore kind of kicked him to the curb as far as leadership goes, and him and Gillan really took over. And given how successful commercially the Mark II era was under those two's leadership on the studio albums and the live shows, the hard rock sound, it was Blackmore and Gillan who were the most influential members of the band, and by the time of the reunion, that remained the go. They were the two that were the most, that would most assure the group's commercial viability, Blackmore and Gillan. That's what they perceived it to be. And so Blackmore probably held the most sway in the band, followed by Gillan. I suspect in the 80s, Deep Purple reunited. What does Blackmore want? Does he want to do good to the Deep Purple name, or does he want to make more money than Rainbow is making? Everyone wants to make more money than Rainbow is making, let's be honest. And so he's, telling Gillan to rein it in a bit. Don't do your typical quirky, idiosyncratic, lyrical style. Not cool. Blackmore's out. Gillan can do that again here. He may not be able to sing as well as he used to, but he feels more like Ian Gillan of the 70s, or of Gillan the band, because there's not Ritchie Blackmore of the, post-70s era, sellout hack era, telling him what to do. Roger Glover sounds good as ever. Steve Morse is fantastic, as I inferred earlier. Really beautiful addition to the group. Yeah, just seamless and, great musician. Good stuff. Ian Pace, very, very good. And John Lord. I suspect that Ritchie Blackmore was also telling John Lord, listen, man, like that keyboard extravaganza stuff, that's just not going to fly in the commercial world of music these days. John Lord's just along for the ride, happy to get the paycheck. Finally, on Purpendicular, he can be his old self again, and we love it. He's almost my favorite aspect of this album, I would say. I would consider this the finest of the Deep Purple Morse era if it weren't for Whoosh. Those two are really good. Now what I like quite a lot as well, though. I don't know what they're like live. If people don't like Morse's take on Blackmore's music live, that's fair enough, but in the studio, I think they do a superlative job. I really like it. Zeppelin and Deep Purple can be compared and contrasted. I think Zeppelin's the obvious choice of the best hard rock band of the 70s, and then Deep Purple kind of, historically, if you look at the facts, kind of deliberately ripped them off for in rock. But there are some who would prefer Deep Purple. I know at least... I've met a few people, both from at the time and people who listen in retrospect, and they say, oh no, I like Zeppelin, but I like Deep Purple more. They enjoy Machine Head and In Rock, Fireball, Made in Japan, more so than the Zeppelin work on, say, Four Houses of the Holy, the first album, Zeppelin's discography, Because they only made albums in the 70s, unfortunately. Bottom's passing. I might prefer the sound of Deep Purple because I'm a sucker for organ and the Doors and prog, it is what it is. I don't think Deep Purple put out albums that were... Machine Head's amazing. I don't think it touches the best Zeppelin albums, though. Houses of the Holy 4, even the first album. Machine Head's not better than those, in my humble opinion. What Deep Purple have over Zeppelin in the long run, and it's not as though Zeppelin ought to have replaced Bonham. I think it's probably ultimately for the best that they didn't attempt to reunite or put out a new studio album. That album that Page and Plant put out, the live album, No Quarter in the 90s... That's I'm cool with that. Plus the Celebration Day show, which I actually saw a cinema screening of back in 2012. That was pretty cool. Meanwhile, Purple have an extensive discography with many interesting features and periods and priorities. And then we have this era with some newer modern classics in Purpendicular, maybe even Bananas, I guess now what you could say, and Whoosh, amazing. We'll make a Whoosh video. We'll explain our thoughts on that release. I think it's the fact that Deep Purple shamelessly embody that early 70s hard rock sound, and the organ bumper gives you a great feel-good punch as well. It's a sound that isn't really focused upon in rock music after the 1970s, that keyboard organ sound. And so, something so encapsulative, I don't think that's a word actually, Deep Purple is the apotheosis of a certain moment in the 70s of kind of hard rock, post-hippie idealism, which can be attained via, say, rocking out to Deep Purple. Interesting world. If Deep Purple is one's favourite band, it's because they feel as though the hard rock scene of the early 1970s was just the best place to be. And it was an idyllic utopian place, still relishing in the residue of the hippie era, and it felt as though the 70s could still realise a kind of countercultural freedom, a living for, what one, rather wants than, sort of obligations and duty and all the other nonsense of the prior, old world patriarchal, claptrap. And, the 70s moved on and the 80s became all about commercialism and Reagan and, making money, and the hippy-dippy crap was being moved aside, probably deliberately because of some government project, but, whatever. Deep Purple conformed to that as well, sadly, in the 80s. Although those who are true Deep Purple fans, I suspect, know that the early 70s period was where it was at. Or when they're best evoking that period again in the modern day, on albums like Purpendicular, for example. Now, I've spoken enough about Deep Purple. If you want to hear more waffling on about Deep Purple, assuming you are not aware of these, the In Rock review features me reading out a piece I wrote in a self-published zine a year ago about Deep Purple, which summarises my thoughts on the band more in depth, although it's not as current as the thoughts I shared here, although it's more or less, it's close enough. And the Machine Head review, which is quite nice. My favourite Deep Purple album, a lot of other people's as well. Thanks for listening to this. If you have, you've persevered very well. I admire that. Thanks again, my friends. Have the best possible day, night you have ever imagined, or ever could imagine.